Affairs. Well, let's bring on our panel now. Let's start in Vancouver, because there for us is Glenn Carl, a former CIA agent responsible for evaluating foreign threats. In London, Vladimir Ashurkov, he is the executive director of the Russian Anti-Corruption Foundation. In the same city in London, Marcus Papadopoulos. He's an editor at Politics First magazine. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. Glenn Carl, I'd like to start with you. The British government is convinced that Russia is behind this. What evidence from what you've been able to gather from all that way in Vancouver about what's happened in the town of Salisbury leads you to point to any potential foreign country that may be responsible for what happened?
Well, thank you for having me. Of course, I can only rely on what we read in the various media we have access to. However, the signs from the nerve agent and my knowledge of and trust in the British intelligence authorities make it quite clear that it was the Russians who were involved. The British wouldn't, on something like this, fabricate an accusation of that sort, and I think there's actual evidence. It's important to note that this attempted assassination is, I believe, the 21st to occur by the Russians in the United Kingdom in the last decade. There are several that have been high profile of dissidents or people who have oligarchs from Russia who crossed purposes with Vladimir Putin, but then there are the attendants and assistants to these individuals. And until now, the Russians have acted largely with impunity, which is a shocking and very alarming trend. So the British response now is late, but welcome.
Marcus, what do you say to that? Because as Glenn has pointed out, Sergei Skripal and his daughter, the attack on them while they are still alive, there are a number, at least a dozen, suspicious deaths of Russian nationals in the United Kingdom.
Well, despite the proclamations by the British government, there hasn't been an ounce of evidence, I repeat, an ounce of evidence forthcoming to successfully blame Russia for the hideous event in Salisbury. Now, Theresa May this week in the House of Commons said, and I quote, "It is highly likely that the Russian state was responsible." Well, excuse me, but highly likely is not good enough. No proper, legitimate court of law anywhere in the world would convict someone on the basis that he or she is most likely to have committed the crime. What happened in Salisbury remains a mystery, and we need to ask, why are the British authorities not providing the Russian government with samples of this nerve agent, which were allegedly used to kill Sergei Skripal and his daughter? And we must not rely on British mainstream media. British mainstream media is neither independent nor free, and it is not in the slightest bit reliable one way whatsoever. No court of law would rely on anything that the British mainstream media says.
OK, so maybe at the moment we haven't got enough evidence for a criminal conviction. But Michelle Carlin, the toxicologist from Northumbria University, has just told us that Novichok used to be manufactured in the Soviet Union and therefore Russia would have access to it, when the British government said to the Russians, why don't you at least admit that if you're not responsible for this attack, that you lost control of some Novichok? We're not denying, are we, surely, that, as Glenn said, that the British government is lying about what specific substance was used for the chemical attack. The Russians didn't give the British any sort of answer at all. In fact, Theresa May said that they were basically sarcastic.
Since when is the British government a beacon of morality, a beacon of honesty? The British government, in terms of its foreign policy, is one of the most duplicitous, one of the most cunning in the world. And what we know is that in the last 4 years, ever since the crisis erupted in Ukraine, a very spiteful, vindictive, anti-Russian campaign has been waged by the British government, not just against the Russian state, but also the Russian people. And I believe that who benefits from this awful case in Salisbury It's certainly not the Russian government. It's not in the interests of the Russian government to assassinate Mr. Skripal, but it is in the interests for the British government to blame the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal on the Kremlin, because that will justify Britain's hardline stance on Russia. It will justify Britain's existing sanctions on the Russian economy, and it will justify further British sanctions on the Russian economy. We have to remember that any government, any party could have been responsible for this monstrous event in Salisbury. We mustn't rule out the Ukrainian government. I mean, I'm talking earlier about who benefits from this. Well, I would say the Ukrainian government is one party which should be investigated. At the end of the day, Ukraine used to be a part of the Soviet Union, and it's not implausible that Ukrainian scientists have access to this nerve agent.
Okay, but at the moment we're talking about UK-Russia relations. Vladimir, let's bring you in, because Theresa May has stood before the British Parliament and said that it's tragic that Putin has chosen to act in this way. So she's really pointing the finger at the very, very top of the Russian government, not necessarily saying that Vladimir Putin ordered this attack, which a British public inquiry some years ago found that it was highly likely that Vladimir Putin had ordered the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, another Russian citizen who was poisoned in the United Kingdom and died, but she's still pointing the finger at the very top of Russian politics.
I think it will take some time for us to know whether this attack was sanctioned from the top of the Russian government or whether it was some rogue agent in Russian security services. But the choice of the poison, highly sophisticated nerve agent, clearly points to Russia.
Okay, Glenn, because of your experience with the CIA, and this pertains to all of you and also will inform the viewers somewhat, Boris Berezovsky, Russian national, died in 2013 in suspicious circumstances. He initially was deemed to have hung himself, but then when an expert looked at the marks, the ligature marks on his neck, that expert found that the marks weren't in the form of a V, which would account for someone hanging themselves, that Boris Berezovsky had a cut at the back of his head and that he had a broken rib as well. So therefore, there was an open verdict returned by the coroner. There was Alexander Pilinchny, if you excuse my pronunciation, a man who made his money in banking in Russia and then came to the UK and started to give details about how people connected to the Russian government were laundering money with his help. He went out for a jog near his home in Surrey in the south of England, and he collapsed when the people who came to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation gave him that resuscitation. They said that his mouth tasted as if you were licking a battery, and they found a substance which was highly toxic inside his stomach. There are many, many other examples. What is the state of Russian espionage at the moment, Glenn? Could they, if they wanted to, carry out these kind of attacks? As I say, I've only given you two examples. I've got a whole list of them. The British Home Secretary has been urged to investigate these deaths of Russian nationals in the UK.
Yes, as I say, I think the number is 21 in the UK alone. Two data points. Since the end of the Cold War, which is now 25 years ago, Russia has residing in and active in the United States more intelligence officers than it did prior to the end of the Cold War, and more than the United States employs in the world. Two, since the end of the Cold War and in the last decade, I think, or so, Russia has residing in and active in the United Kingdom more intelligence officers than it has ever had before, including during the Cold War. We know that Russia assassinates people. It has become more aggressive in recent years under Vladimir Putin, as he is asserting in his efforts to recreate the Russian empire, frankly, and solidify his control of the near abroad and challenge any opponent. He has been able to act largely with impunity in the United Kingdom for at least a decade, and all of these things are quite clearly known. One point I'll add on the proof required in a court of law. Intelligence work is designed to be undetectable, and there is always a tension. I've worked a lot with the American law enforcement authorities, the FBI, between the standards that intelligence services use and those required in a court of law. It is rare that one can obtain adequate proof for an intelligence operation to reach a conviction in a court of law. It's designed that way. That said, contrary to what our colleague said a couple of minutes ago, the evidence of the cases, a few of which you just mentioned, is overwhelming, and there's ample media of diverse sources that lay out the facts.
Okay, I'm glad you answered that, because I was going to ask you what the smoking gun would be in a case like this, but you've kind of covered that. Marcus, if I were to ask you kind of the same question and put those accusations against the deaths of those Russian nationals in the United Kingdom and any responsibility that Russia may have, it's pretty obvious what your answer is going to be. But if I ask you and point out that there are many countries in the world that since Vladimir Putin has been in charge, both as president and prime minister, who now don't trust Russia at all. Can you give me an answer that doesn't include an accusation against the moral authority of the British government, but just address that one particular issue of Russia standing in the world and how so many countries don't trust it?
There are many, many countries in the world which do not trust Britain and certainly do not trust America. And I find it laughable that this former CIA agent has the audacity to say that the Russian state kills people abroad. Russia is not an angel, but America is certainly not an angel. Please don't tell me and viewers of this program that the CIA does not murder people abroad. What an absolutely peculiar, unsubstantiated, unintelligent accusation to make. The British are also responsible for murdering opponents.
Yes, but if one fact happens, it doesn't mean that the other fact doesn't necessarily happen either, does it?
But then we need to have evidence, don't we? We need to have concrete evidence that the Russian state is responsible for the heinous attempt to murder Mr. Skripal in Salisbury. No concrete evidence has been forthcoming. No details have been forthcoming. It's very easy for the former CIA agent to say that the Russian state is responsible, but on the basis of what exactly?
Okay,
and
Marcus.
We all know about CIA evidence. We all know about the CIA claims about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. I wouldn't trust the CIA in the slightest bit whatsoever.
OK, we've only got a couple of minutes. So what will the reaction, do you think, be in Moscow to what Theresa May has announced the British retaliation to this event is? Because as far as I can tell, the most serious consequence is the expulsion of 23 diplomats. And at the end of the day, that doesn't really count for much, does it? She could have done so much more. Moscow and the people in the Kremlin, whatever their admission of guilt, lack of admission of guilt, whether they did it or not, they'll be thinking, this really isn't anything, surely.
Well, historically speaking, relations between Britain and Russia have been marked by mutual hostility, mutual bitterness, and mutual suspicion. And the current relationship between Russia and Britain is absolutely atrocious. And indeed, Moscow regards relations with London as of secondary importance. I don't think the Russians will be surprised by Theresa May's statement. I think that the Russians will probably expel a number of British diplomats, and should the British government attempt to revoke the broadcasting license of RT, then I suspect the Russians will revoke the license of perhaps BBC News and other British media outlets. But I'm not surprised with how the British government has responded. Britain and Russia have never liked each other since diplomatic relations were established between the two in the 1500s. And quite simply speaking, they never will like each other. But let me just state again, Russia is not an angel, but neither is Britain, and certainly the United States of America is not an angel.
Glenn, Vladimir, Marcus, thank you very much for your time. Coming up on the Newsmakers was an assassination attempt in Gaza, trying to wreck a future alliance between rival Palestinian parties. And remembering Stephen Hawking, we examine the life and work of one of science's greatest minds. An assassination attempt against the Palestinian Prime Minister has risked collapsing an alliance between rival parties Hamas and Fatah. A roadside bomb targeting Rami Hamdallah's motorcade exploded in Gaza. He survived, but then the blame game began. The Palestinian Authority pointed the finger at Hamas. Hamas accused Israel of being behind it. So will both factions keep the peace after the attempted hit on Hamdallah? Shoaib Hassan reports.
An attack in the Gaza Strip has shaken the Palestinian Authority. A bomb lobbed at a convoy carrying Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah and the PA's intelligence chief.
It's early to accuse anyone, but whoever is controlling Gaza is responsible for securing the scene.
That's Hamas, the hardline Palestinian political organization that's controlled the Gaza Strip since it won elections there in 2006. Hamas, for its part, has reportedly blamed Israel. Hamas was founded in 1987 after the first Palestinian Intifada. It does not recognize the State of Israel and says it wants to create the State of Palestine along its pre-1947 borders. Hamas also enjoys close ties with Hezbollah in Lebanon as well as the government of Iran, while Israel and most Western countries have officially designated Hamas a terrorist organization. Hamas briefly softened its stance towards Israel